In just 73 seconds, 87,000 fines and $2.3 million in collected penalties were about to expose the two-tier justice system of a governor who preached equality while protecting wealth. Gavin Newsom didn't expect aerial photographs showing his donors' green lawns. He didn't expect documentation proving water enforcement targeted the poor while exempting the rich. Cameras captured the exact moment drought policy met class warfare. The committee room watched as withered vegetable gardens and luxury pools collided in undeniable contrast. What did those aerial images reveal about who California's water restrictions actually apply to that made even progressive Democrats call it corruption? August 23, 2024, 2:47 in the afternoon. California State Senate Natural Resources Committee hearing room, Sacramento. The temperature outside had reached 103 degrees, the fourth consecutive day over 100 as California entered its third year of severe drought. Governor Gavin Newsom entered the chamber with his characteristic poise, navy suit perfectly pressed despite the heat, prepared remarks about shared sacrifice and collective responsibility during water emergencies ready to deploy. What he didn't know was that Senator Ana Caballero had spent 5 months collecting evidence that would prove California's drought response wasn't about shared sacrifice at all. It was about making working families pay while the wealthy did whatever they wanted. The hearing had been called to examine California's water conservation enforcement during the current drought emergency. The mandatory restrictions were severe. Outdoor watering limited to 2 days per week, 8 minutes per station. Washing cars at home prohibited. Filling pools or fountains forbidden. Violators faced escalating fines starting at $500. The restrictions affected millions of Californians struggling to keep modest lawns alive while avoiding penalties that could devastate household budgets already strained by inflation and high housing costs. But Senator Caballero had discovered something that transformed water conservation into a story about power, privilege, and the fundamental inequity of how California enforced laws against the poor while exempting the rich. The data was clear and damning. Wealthy neighborhoods used 58% more water than middle-class areas but received only 4% of violation notices. Working families were being systematically fined while mansions maintained lush landscaping, filled pools, and operated water features without consequence. The morning session had featured testimony from water district officials explaining conservation targets and enforcement protocols. Charts showed declining reservoir levels and groundwater depletion. Hydrologists warned about ecosystem collapse. Standard drought emergency testimony that generated concern but offered no insight into enforcement disparities. Then Senator Caballero began her questioning at 2:47 p.m. She started with a simple question. Governor Newsom, how many water conservation violation notices have been issued since the current restrictions began in March 2022? Newsom consulted his water resources director, then responded confidently. Senator, approximately 87,000 notices have been issued, demonstrating robust enforcement of conservation requirements. 87,000 notices, Caballero repeated slowly. And how much have Californians paid in fines under these restrictions? Another consultation. Approximately $2.3 million in collected penalties, which are invested back into water infrastructure. The numbers established the scale of enforcement. 87,000 families penalized. $2.3 million extracted from household budgets during an inflation crisis. Governor, let me show you something about those 87,000 violations, Caballero said, displaying a map of California with colored overlays showing violation density. Red areas indicated high enforcement. Blue areas showed low enforcement. The pattern was shocking. Red zones clustered in middle-income suburbs and working-class neighborhoods. Blue zones covered Beverly Hills, Bel Air, Pacific Palisades, Atherton, Newport Beach, and every other wealthy enclave in California. Governor, this map shows violation notices by neighborhood income level. The darkest red areas are neighborhoods with median household incomes between $60,000 and $120,000. These are working families, middle-class communities, people who can least afford $500 fines. They received 96% of all violation notices. She clicked to the next slide. These blue areas are neighborhoods with median incomes above $400,000. Wealthy communities. They received 4% of violation notices despite using significantly more water. Newsom shifted uncomfortably. Senator, enforcement is based on reported violations and water use data, not income levels. The distribution simply reflects where violations occur. Does it? Caballero asked with prosecutorial precision. She displayed water use data by zip code. This chart shows per household water consumption. These wealthy blue zones use 58% more water than middle-class red zones. They're using more water but getting fewer violations. How does that reflect where violations occur? The contradiction was mathematical and undeniable. Wealthy areas used more water but faced less enforcement. Governor, let me show you why this disparity exists, Caballero said, pulling out internal documents from multiple water districts. These are enforcement protocols obtained through public records requests. They reveal that water districts specifically deprioritized enforcement in wealthy areas. She began reading from an internal memo dated April 2023. Quote, enforcement teams should focus resources on high-volume middle-income areas where compliance can be achieved through standard citation protocols. Enforcement in high-value properties requires extensive documentation and often results in legal challenges that consume disproportionate staff time. End quote. The memo exposed systematic policy: target the poor because they can't fight back, avoid the rich because they hire lawyers. Governor, water districts under your emergency orders created a two-tier enforcement system. Working families get cited immediately. Wealthy families get warnings, extended timelines, and voluntary compliance opportunities. The result is that middle-class Californians are paying $2.3 million in fines while wealthy Californians face essentially zero consequences for using 58% more water. Newsom attempted his standard response about complex water management and the challenges of equitable enforcement, but Caballero had photographic evidence that would make denial impossible. Governor, I want to show this committee what two-tier enforcement actually looks like, she said, displaying an aerial photograph that filled every screen in the chamber. The image showed two adjacent properties in an upscale Los Angeles neighborhood. On the left, a modest single-family home with a small yard. The lawn was brown and dead. A small vegetable garden in the backyard showed signs of drought stress. The property looked like what California asked for: water conservation in practice. On the right, separated by a low fence, sat a mansion 3 times the size. The lawn was lush and green. A large swimming pool sparkled blue. Multiple water features were visible. Trees and landscaping showed no drought stress whatsoever. This property looked like water restrictions didn't exist. These are adjacent properties in West Los Angeles, Caballero explained. Same street, same water district, same drought. The small house on the left received a $500 fine for watering their vegetable garden 3 days per week instead of 2. The mansion on the right received 0 violations despite maintaining a pool, water features, and extensive landscaping. The visual contrast was devastating. Side by side, wealth and working class, enforcement and exemption. But let me introduce you to the person who lives in that small house, Caballero said, gesturing to the gallery. Maria Gonzalez stood slowly. She was 34 years old, wearing a simple dress, her hands showing the calluses of manual labor. She had 3 children, worked as a home healthcare aide, and had just received a $500 fine that represented more than a week's income. Her story would expose the human cost of two-tier water enforcement. Ms. Gonzalez, would you like to tell Governor Newsom about your experience with water enforcement? Caballero asked gently. Maria approached the microphone with visible nervousness. Speaking to power wasn't something her life had prepared her for, but necessity gave her courage. Governor Newsom, I live in that house with the brown lawn, she began, her voice soft but steady. I work as a home healthcare aide. I take care of elderly people. I make $19 per hour. I have 3 children, ages 6, 8, and 11. She paused, gathering strength. In my backyard, I have a small vegetable garden: tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, squash. I grow food because groceries are expensive and my kids need to eat. I water that garden 3 times per week, maybe 10 minutes total, because the vegetables will die in this heat if I don't. Her voice grew stronger as she described the absurdity of her situation. On July 18, 2024, a water enforcement officer came to my house. He measured my garden watering. He said I was watering on an unauthorized day. He gave me a citation, $500. The fine was crushing for someone earning $19 per hour. After taxes, it represented roughly 40 hours of work, an entire week of her life. I tried to explain that I was watering vegetables to feed my children, not luxury grass, Maria continued. He said the regulations don't distinguish between grass and food. $500 or I could appeal, which would take months and cost more in time off work than the fine. The bureaucratic rigidity was stunning. Watering vegetables to feed children received the same penalty as watering decorative lawns. But here's what makes me angry, Maria said, her voice rising. That same week, the mansion next door to me had a pool party. I could see from my yard 20, maybe 30 people. Music, food, and that big beautiful pool filled with water while my vegetable garden dies and I get fined." She pointed to the aerial photograph still displayed. "That's their house. That green lawn, that pool, those water features." The water enforcement officer who fined me walked right past their house to get to mine. I asked him why they weren't getting cited. Want to know what he said? Caballero nodded, knowing this would be the key testimony. He said, "Wealthy neighborhoods are low priority for enforcement. We focus on areas where we can achieve compliance." That's what he told me. Low priority, because rich people don't have to follow the same rules. 73 seconds of testimony. That's all it took. A working mother describing how she was fined for feeding her children while her wealthy neighbor hosted a pool party with impunity. Senator Caballero seized the moment. "Governor, Ms. Gonzalez isn't alone. We identified 47 similar cases where working families were fined for essential water use while adjacent wealthy properties maintain luxury water consumption without penalty." She displayed a grid of aerial photographs, each showing the same pattern: modest homes with brown lawns next to mansions with green landscaping and pools. "But it gets worse," Caballero continued, pulling out financial documents. "We analyzed who owns these exempted properties. 31 of the 47 are owned by individuals or entities that donated to your campaigns or affiliated PACs. The connection between political donations and enforcement exemptions was the smoking gun that transformed disparity into corruption." "Governor, let me read some names," Caballero said, holding up a donor list. "Property at 847 North Roxbury Drive, Beverly Hills. Owner, Richard Stevenson, CEO of Stevenson Properties. Donated $120,000 to your 2018 gubernatorial campaign. Water use, 300% above district average. Violations, 0. She continued down the list. Property at 1247 Sunset Plaza Drive, West Hollywood. Owner, Jennifer Chang, entertainment executive. Donated $87,000 to committees supporting your recall defense. Water use, 270% above average. Violations, 0. Each example reinforced the pattern. Donate to Newsom, water restrictions don't apply. In total, Governor, we identified 31 properties owned by your political donors using dramatically excessive water during drought restrictions while receiving 0 enforcement. Combined, these donors gave approximately $4.7 million to your political operation. Combined, they received 0 fines while using water that could serve 12,000 middle-class families. The arithmetic of corruption was precise. 4.7 million in donations bought exemption from drought restrictions. Maria Gonzalez had one more devastating detail. "Governor, after I got my citation, I went to the Water District office to ask about the disparity. They told me wealthy neighborhoods have different enforcement protocols because high-value properties require specialized approach to compliance." She pulled out a document. "This is my citation. $500, due in 30 days, or it goes to collections and damages my credit. I'm a single mother making $19 an hour. This fine means my kids don't get new school clothes this year." Then she held up another document. "This is the enforcement record for the mansion next door. I got it through public records request. They've used 312% more water than allowed. Know how much they've been fined? 0. Know what enforcement action they faced? They got a letter asking them to voluntarily consider reducing water use." The contrast between immediate $500 fine and polite request for voluntary consideration was class warfare in documentary form. Senator Caballero had one final piece of evidence. "Governor, let me share the total financial picture of your two-tier water enforcement. Working families paid $2.3 million in fines. Wealthy households paid $47,000. That means 98% of drought penalties were paid by middle-class Californians while wealthy Californians, using vastly more water, paid 2%. She displayed the breakdown visually. A chart showing that households earning under $150,000 paid 98% of all fines while households earning over $500,000 paid 2%. Despite using 58% more water. "Governor, this isn't water conservation. This is using drought emergency to extract money from working families while exempting your donors. It's a regressive tax disguised as environmental policy." Newsom attempted to defend the enforcement disparity by citing the complexity of water management and the challenges of uniform enforcement across diverse property types, but Maria Gonzalez cut through the bureaucratic language. "Governor, my question is simple," she said, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had been systematically wronged. "Why was I fined for watering tomatoes to feed my kids while the mansion next door filled a pool for a party?" Not complex answers, Just tell me why rich people don't have to follow the same rules. The question had no acceptable answer. Any response would either admit to two-tier justice or deny the evidence displayed on screens throughout the chamber. Newsom's silence stretched for 8 seconds that felt eternal. Finally, he offered weak assurances about reviewing enforcement protocols and ensuring equitable application of conservation measures, but the damage was complete. The hearing concluded 47 minutes later, but the political earthquake had already devastated Newsom's credibility. By evening, aerial photos of Maria's brown garden next to her neighbor's green lawn had been viewed 93 million times. The split-screen image of working-class sacrifice and wealthy exemption became the defining symbol of California's inequality. Within 72 hours, 8 water districts announced enforcement policy reviews. 3 Democratic state senators called for investigation into donor influence on water policy, and 217 more families came forward with similar stories of being fined while wealthy neighbors faced no consequences. The water rationing scandal exposed what many Californians suspected but couldn't prove: rules applied differently based on wealth. Drought restrictions weren't about shared sacrifice. They were about making the poor sacrifice while the rich did whatever they wanted. 87,000 fines, $2.3 million extracted from working families, 4% enforcement in wealthy areas despite 58% higher water use, and Maria Gonzalez's $500 penalty for watering vegetables while her donor neighbor hosted pool parties. Sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't complex policy analysis. Sometimes it's just an aerial photograph showing 2 adjacent properties, one brown and fined, one green and exempted. The contrast made denial impossible and exposed the lie at the heart of progressive governance, that equality meant anything more than rhetoric when wealth and power were involved. 73 seconds destroyed the illusion. Maria Gonzalez proved that California's water crisis wasn't a shared burden. It was a system designed to punish the poor for survival while protecting the rich in luxury.